Right then, so this month we're going to be talking about karma. So there's going to be two lessons on karma in the fast track, two roughly 2 hour lessons of karma, and really that's only scratching the surface of what is of the stuff to talk about in karma. And hopefully after this lesson you'll see what I mean, and I'll talk through this lesson about where we're going to expand on in certain areas, where we need to expand on in certain areas, because this lesson is more of a summary of the basics of the idea of karma, or the theory of karma. So today we're going to talk about karma, like I said. So what is karma exactly? That's the first question we need to ask ourselves, isn't it? Because there are lots of different myths out there about karma, aren't there? There's lots of stories about karma, there's lots of legends about karma. Karma, the concept in popular mythology sort of tends to come from the Eastern spiritual traditions and religions, but there is a version of karma in many different cultures. But it's grown much more than that, hasn't it? It's found its way into New Age spirituality. It's found its way into sort of popular culture, and people use the word here and there willy-nilly to mean all sorts of different things, really. So let's look at a couple of myths, and let's look at a couple of concepts that invokes in people when they use the word karma. Some people say it's the fruit of our actions. Now, you could say there's some truth to that, because it's a consequence of the things we do, but if we look a little bit closer, it's not actually our actions, it's our thoughts. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. It's our thoughts that are producing the actual karma. So there's some truth to that, you could say. So I should just say, all actions, if you think about it, all actions are preceded by thoughts. We think about something and then we do something. So there's some truth in it, but we need to back it up a little bit. It's the thought process, it's not the actions that are actually producing the karma. Judgment, a lot of people think it's some universal judgment, a force of judgment, or God's judgment, or the universe's judgment. Well, I would say here that that's absolutely false. And I think that when we teach karma, we should try and remove that aspect of it, because it just adds more negative emotions on top of it when you think about karma in that way. If you think about the suffering that you go through in your life, the things that happen to you, if you're constantly thinking, that I must have been bad, I must have done something wrong, then it's not good for us, is it? It's not good for humans. It's just adding more self-judgment, adding more negativity. So it's not a judgment, and it's not a universal judgment at all. And we'll get to what it is in a second. What you put out comes back to you. Well, you could say that there's some truth to that, I suppose. A loose truth, because it is a consequence of some kind. It is a consequence to our thinking patterns. Some people say it's cause and effect. I'd say that's pretty accurate. There is a cause and there is an effect. You go through a thinking process, you cause some karma, and then there is an effect, because you're burning that karma in the future, which is causing emotional reactions. We'll talk about that more in a second. Now, again, I should just mention, everyone that does this lesson will have done the self-healing lessons, the pyramid course, and there is a bit about karma in the emotional layer lesson. So the very basics of what we're talking about with karma will have been talked about with anyone doing this lesson, as all you guys have done before, obviously. What goes around comes around. Well, that's a little bit like what you put out comes back to you, but some people think of it in those terms. It's very loosely you could say that there's some accuracy there, but very loosely, of course. Divine punishment. Some people think that it's some sort of punishment, a little bit like the judgment. Some people may think it's a punishment for doing wrong things. Well, again, I think here when we're teaching karma, we should get rid of that completely. And in the same sort of fashion as the judgment thing, if we start thinking about punishment, then we have to start thinking about some sort of being who is dishing out judgments and punishments, and that's not how the universe works at all. It's a very traditional view of religion, or religious kind of thought, really, isn't it? And that's not how nature works. That's not how biological systems work. And our our concept of karma is a biological mechanism. It's a biological evolution. So of course it's got nothing to do with punishment. It's got nothing to do with, especially not divine punishment. And universal law. Well, this is an interesting one. I mean, some people think the law of karma is just like a universal law, like gravity or something like that. Well, this depends on which way you look at it, really. But in one way you could say, no, it's not a universal law, because karma is a biological system. It evolved through evolution of animals as a survival mechanism. You know, we'll talk about that in a second. So it's personal to life on this planet, and it's not a universal law, and karma changes over the years, morality changes over the years. So you can look at it in that type of way, or you can look at it from another perspective, and that is the perspective that actually karma evolved with emotions. It's about emotions, and emotions evolved in the journey of life as a result of duality, a split between positive and negative. All right, and emotions evolved, really, you could say, for the purpose of suffering, and then suffering leads us back towards self-realization, and the universe is self-realization. So, you know, if you look at it from a universal perspective, you could say that it has something to do with the evolution of the universe as a universal law. But karma itself is not a universal law. Karma is on this planet, in this journey of life. Whereas, you know, there's probably a different system on other planets. Not necessarily karma, because that's personal to the evolution on this planet. But there's going to be a different type of equivalent, let's say, on other planets. So we can make a universal law out of it, but it's not to do with karma necessarily. And we talk about universal law of healing, don't we, in the A Guide to Healing, in that diagram. Okay, any questions about that so far? Okay, so what is it? Well, karma is all about memory. So let's start there. When we use the word karma, it's all about memory. And there's lots of different types of memory in the human system, or animals for that matter. And that means there's lots of different types of karma. And some types of karma, you could say, have already been discovered in mainstream science and medicine and healthcare. And some haven't. So let me take you back to this diagram here about biological reincarnation. You've seen this before, where you know, the orange and red bits are the material body and lower mind. That's one incarnation. And then you've got this higher mind, or the soul, you could say, which is reincarnating into these different incarnations. And that is a type of memory, isn't it? So that's labelled there, memory. So the soul, you could say, is a type of memory, or certainly when it first evolved as a type of memory. And that's the human system, the material body, low mind, and then the soul. That's the human system. Well, we can expand on this diagram, and we could say, well, actually, there's another type of memory involved in this diagram, because the lower mind and the material body also have a type of memory, don't they? And we know about that, don't we? That's genetics and DNA and stuff like that. That's the ancestral lineage of this material body. So that is a type of karma, you can say. 1 second, I just heard a noise. Has someone got a question or something? Okay. Never mind. Right, so another diagram I want to remind you guys about is these vehicles, the frameworks of the human system. Now, you've seen this before, haven't you? So the different energy frameworks that we have in the human system, the higher mind, the energy body, the lower mind, the material body. So if you remember, the higher mind and the energy body is the soul, and the lower mind and the material body is one incarnation. Now, each of these different frameworks have a different type of memory associated with them. So higher mind genetics, we're not going to talk about that really in this lesson, or probably in the next lesson either. But just briefly, the higher mind genetics is a memory or a set of genetics all within the higher mind energy framework, and it holds. Hi Kevin, how you doing? And it holds a complete set of. You could say a complete set of all the genetics from the lower mind and the material body of all its incarnations. We're not going to talk about that. That's going to be advanced at some really advanced level at some point. We'll have to look into that. Okay, so we'll put that aside for a minute. But the energy body, well, that has a memory in it, and it's called karma emotion. And this is the karma emotion we've been talking about in the emotional layer. And generally speaking, the karma emotion of the energy body that's stored in the energy body is most of the time is what people are talking about when they use the word karma, to be honest. But of course there's more types of memory. You've got lower mind genetics and DNA. Now DNA is the material body memory, you could say, that blueprint which is inside every cell of the human body. Lower mind genetics is attached to that, so that's part of the same thing, but it's in the lower mind, which means it's made of magnetic energy, but it's wrapped around the DNA molecule. And I put epigenetics in there as well, because that's important, because that's a type of emotional memory, or a slightly different type of memory associated with DNA. We're going to talk about that in a second. So you could say that the lower mind genetics plus the DNA is the ancestral line that we already know about, that everyone knows about. 99% of people on the planet have accepted, part of mainstream science, of course, and genetics is a huge field in biology and science. But there's a second ancestral line that we don't know about, or that mainstream doesn't know about, and that is the higher mind genetics and the karma emotion. And that is part of our goals, is to bring that out into the open with our research projects. So like I said, I'm not going to talk about higher mind genetics, certainly not in this lesson. We are going to talk a lot about karma emotion. That's the main purpose of this lesson. And we're not going to talk about lower mind genetics that much. We'll talk a little bit about DNA and epigenetics. So we've talked a fair bit about DNA in this course already. So really I'm just going over the basics here just to remind you about DNA. And that's our ancestral lineage of the material body, of course. It's a molecule. The DNA molecule is a double helix, as you can see on the screen. This twisting pattern is a molecule, and it holds a code. It holds a code of different molecules in different orders, which creates a code. And that goes into creating our genes. And our genes are hereditary. We pass them on through reproduction to our children. And this DNA molecule is wound up in lots and lots of tight little bundles, and they're called chromosomes. And that's what DNA is. So now let's look a little bit closer and say, okay, here's a DNA strand for you. And a segment, you could say, is one gene. A segment of a DNA strand is one gene. And that gene has a code, an order of different types of molecules, which acts a little bit like a language. And we have talked about this before, but let's say that's one gene. Now let's look a little bit closer at that one gene. And imagine that there is a switch on the end of that gene. It switches the gene on and off in basic terms. And that's what epigenetics is. So genes can be switched on and off. And the interesting thing about epigenetics is that it can be switched on and off throughout the course of our lives. Now, traditional genetics, now when I learned genetics at school, we didn't know about epigenetics because it's a fairly recent thing, last 10, 20 years or so. But when I was at school, they didn't know about epigenetics. They knew a lot about genetics. So, we learned all about genetics. But the view was that genes can't be changed throughout your life. You're born with your set of genes, and that's it. That's it for life. And genes can only change through mutations in the reproductive process. But now we know differently. And we know that through epigenetics, genes can be turned on and off throughout the course of our lives. And in fact, they do constantly, probably millions of times every second. And this is how the body regulates itself. Constantly, genes are being switched on and off all the way through your life. And on top of that, they found that certain things can actually impact or influence the switching of genes on and off. And that includes things like your emotional state or your environment or your lifestyle. So that actually shows us that how we live our lives can actually impact our genome. And that can be passed on to our children as well. Now, this corresponds to a common term which is sometimes called ancestral karma. It's a type of karma. So it's been known about for thousands of years, but it's never been really explained in this particular way, in a scientific way. Also, within that term ancestral karma, you could put lower mind genetics as well, because that DNA molecule there is a molecule made of matter, but actually there's more to it than that. So the field of epigenetics is going to grow because there is a lower mind genetics which is all wrapped up within that molecule as well, made out of subtle energy. And the lower mind genetics has all sorts of other information attached to it as well, because the lower mind is although it's attached to the material body, it's got other stuff going on in it, like all the karma organs, for example. The karma organs, which we're going to talk about in a minute, they are created during the incarnation as the baby grows in the womb, for example. The material body is growing, but you know, the lower mind is also growing, so that also needs a set of instructions. And that's held in the lower mind genetics. They are completely without you knowing. However, yes, you can have some control over it by controlling things like your emotions, your environment, and your lifestyle. So yes, we can impact those through our choices. Healing, while I'm at it, because this is a course about healing, isn't it? And yes, we can impact our own DNA through self-energy healing techniques and impact other people's DNA through energy healing as well. And in fact, in many cases of energy healing, you know, that might well be what's going on. And that's going to be part of one of our research projects coming up soon. Right, so let's talk about karma emotion, which is going to be the main focus of this lesson from now on, because really when people say karma, when most of the time they're talking about karma emotion. And most of the little myths and legends and definitions I put in the first screen really refers to karma emotion, to be honest. So let's talk about that. So karma emotion is emotional memory plus a context. Now, this is different from epigenetics, because you could say that epigenetics involves some sort of emotional memory, but there's no context. There's no context in epigenetics. Here you've got a context attached to it. So emotional memory, for example, the memory of fear plus a context, like being afraid of spiders. So spiders is the context, fear is the emotional memory. Now, what we're saying here is that this evolved millions of years ago as a survival tool. So think about a species, an early species of animal, a very, very useful tactic or a very useful adaptation, you could say, genetic adaptation, is for emotions to evolve in the first place. Now, emotions that evolved in the first place were probably things like fear of things that are chasing you, and pleasure, pleasure for things like food or reproduction, for example. So it's a very basic survival. You can see that's how it originated, and how it spread throughout the species has to do with reincarnation. So that's how or why you could say reincarnation evolved in the first place. So reincarnation itself, the theory of biological reincarnation, is that emotional memory managed to survive outside the material body after the material body death and jump into another next generation individual without needing reproduction. So kind of bypassing reproduction. And you can see how that would spread throughout the species much quicker than through reproduction or through parental care. Because you could say that some things are learnt, of course. Some things are learnt from parent to child. But some things are not. Like this would give a reason for animal instincts, for example. The reason why a gazelle, when it's born, it gets up and it knows to run away from the cheetah. And it doesn't need parental care for that. So what do we mean by, first, karma emotion, emotional memory, context? Well, karma emotion is a type of subtle magnetic energy. And it has a programming on it. So karma is the transport system for this emotional memory. So karma is an actual substance made of magnetic energy. It's stored in the energy body. But it's got a programming, of course, because it's got to convey some message. It's got a language to it. It's got a code. It's got a programming. Now, emotional memory, what do we actually mean by that? Well, karma is fuel for the emotional cycle. We talked about that in the emotional layer lesson. It's an actual fuel. Think of it as a fuel. But it's a future fuel. We make karma in the present moment, and that is stored somewhere, and then it's going to be burnt later on at some point in our emotional cycle and cause us emotions. So emotional, that's a type of emotional memory, isn't it? It's future fuel for the emotional cycle. And context, well, I explained what that means. You know, the spiders in arachnophobia, that's the context. And that comes from our conditioned patterns of thinking. That's where the context actually comes from. And we'll talk about the processes of how that works in just a second. So now we're going to talk about different types of karma. And the first thing to say is that there is positive and negative karma. Now I know you guys know this. But all types of karma have a positive and negative aspect. So the next thing to say before I start talking about different types of karma is that this field is absolutely huge, I think. And I'm going to talk about 3 different types of karma here. And it's just scratching the surface. Every time I look more into it, more appears. And so really, we're just in this lesson, we're just going to summarize 3 different types. And quite possibly those 3 different types are going to turn into all sorts of other different types as well. So that's just a warning. So there'll be a basic understanding that we want to give in this lesson, and then in the next lesson, in the part 2, we'll elaborate on it even more, especially with an application into healing, because this lesson is about karma. That the part 2 is going to be applications for karma in healing and healthcare. But we'll elaborate on more types in that lesson, and then when we do the 3rd year of the degree course, when we turn it into a degree course and we do a 3rd year, then I'd love to actually map the whole of the human personality, the whole of the spectrum with all the different types of emotions, all the different types of karmas and how they work, in a very detailed manner. But that's for the future. So first of all, let's just talk about a few different types of karma so that we can give an example of what we're talking about. So there are what we can call basic karmas, and these are, you could say, primal karmas. They evolved first, let's put it that way. In very, very early animals, as soon as emotions started to evolve. And you can't really talk about emotion without talking about karma, because it comes together. So here we're talking about things like survival fears or survival pleasures, things that keep the animal alive. And it's a bit like a stick and a carrot situation. Keep away from one thing or get drawn towards another thing, all to do with survival. Now, these types of karmas are created by thinking, of course. Now, all karmas are created by the thinking process. But in terms of basic karmas, the more you think about the context, whatever it is, the more karma is being created. Just as an aside here, let me remind you guys that you guys on this course are not producing any more karma. Finished producing karma. After the Kundalini phase, no more karma can be produced. All the lower mind organs are got rid of, let's say. It's part of the transformation. So this is not something that applies to you guys, is all I'm trying to say. But this is the human system. And animals, in fact. Yes, of course. So it's thinking about the context which causes the karma. So it's a very basic type of karma. But remember, this has got nothing to do with morality yet. This is purely survival. So that's another thing that's misunderstood with karma, when people think it's about punishment and judgment and things like that. Because this obviously has nothing to do with morality, or it's just purely think about something, you're going to produce karma. Think fearful thoughts, it's going to produce karma. Yeah. Well, I think that's slightly different, because that's not really an emotional response. It's a physical response. It's a chemical response. So bacteria will go, and there's all sorts of life forms that are attracted or repelled from things, but it's chemical reactions. It's mechanical. Here we're talking about feeling emotions, and that needs a filter. an awareness filter. Yes, and then it's linked to sentience as well, isn't it? And consciousness, and what animals are conscious and what animals are not conscious, and also what animals have a soul, what animals are just lower mind without a higher mind. It opens up all those questions, doesn't it? Yeah. Okay, so the next type of karma that we're going to talk about is moral intent karmas. So here you could say, oh, and by the way, Sally, I should also agree with you that it has a lot to do with evolution, because these types of karmas evolved throughout the course of the evolution of life. So basic karmas exist in basic animals. They also exist in humans, of course. It's kept that type of karma all the way through evolution. But then moral intent karmas evolved later on. And then the one I'm going to talk about in a minute evolved even further later on. So this is a journey of the evolution of karma, which goes along with the journey of the evolution of life, the evolution of intelligence, the evolution of awareness, the evolution of sophistication, you could say, in the journey of life. So yeah, karma's evolved along with everything else through a journey. So moral intent karmas started to appear when animals started to live in social groups. Now, this is a survival tactic. It's not a universal moral law, really. It's a survival tactic. It allows animals that live in groups to live together in harmony, it's not perfect, but it goes a long way. It helps social cohesion in a group of animals that are living together. So, when things start to live together, like, dogs, wolves, that sort of thing, monkeys, these types of karmas started to evolve to keep the group together as a species-wide adaptation. So in this case, thinking about doing harm to another animal in the group will cause a type of karma, or a type of a future emotion. And this will produce guilt, which of course is a negative emotion. And it's a way of bringing individuals back into the group for more social cohesion. Now, where does the context come from here? Well, in terms of what's moral or what's not moral, in terms of doing people harm or doing animals harm, well, it's taken from the conditioning patterns in the lower mind. What is deep within the subconscious of what is right and wrong, you could say. That's where the concept of morality has evolved. It's in the subconscious patterns of the lower mind. And where does that come from in an individual? Well, that comes from the society's view of morality, because the individual is conditioned by the collective social conditioning. So it's all linked. And just as an aside again, this changes over time, doesn't it? Morality changes over time. What's acceptable now is different to what was acceptable 1,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago. Morality actually changes. So that's another indication that morality is not a universal law if we look at it from the perspective of karma. And looking at it from a universal perspective is another, and spiritual evolution and self-realization is another viewpoint. And we'll go into that in the next lesson more. Now, moral intent karmas. We're talking about thinking about doing harm here. Well, the opposite is also true, because there are positive moral intent karmas. So if we're thinking about doing good, then we produce positive karmas. So compassion, for example, which is why the Buddhists teach compassion almost above all things, because it helps people evolve. It produces positive karmas. And this produces love, the emotion of love, which is a positive emotion, of course. Now, just to be clear here though, unconditional love is not a karma. Unconditional love is something different, which we'll talk about some other time. This is love plus context. A karma is emotion plus a context. Unconditional love has no context. It's completely unconditional. In fact, you could say that a context is a condition. So we've got basic karmas, we've got moral intent karmas. And thinking about it, you know, all those myths and legends about karma, usually it's talking about those moral intent karmas, isn't it? That's the most widely known about. But you know, it's so twisted. People's view of it, I think, is very twisted. So the next one, the third one, is what we can call reciprocal karmas. And this is more about social interactions. So this kind of thing is a little bit like a rebound effect. Now I'll give you an example for this one. In my previous life, in my directly previous life, I was quite promiscuous. I cheated on his wife quite a few times, let's say. In this life, I grew up very shy around girls, very insecure around girls. There was a rebounding effect. Now, if I go 2 lifetimes back, I was a woman and I was gay. I was a lesbian, and it was not allowed, so I couldn't tell anybody, and I couldn't have any relationships. So that caused a lot of repression. So from that life, I rebounded and became really promiscuous, and then rebounded again and became shy or insecure with girls. And as you can see, there's a rebounding effect, but it's trying to find that balance. It's trying to, it rebounds either way, but less and less and less until you find that balance. And this is where you get this balance scale of personality characteristics. Now, you've seen this before, haven't you? Because this is part of the psychological layer. Personality scales. This is where personality scales come from, because personality scales, of course, are based in emotion, and the negative emotions are out to the side, and the positive emotions are in the middle, in the balance. But it comes from karma, of course. All emotions come from. So these reciprocal karmas are more to do with complex personalities, complex human personalities, and trying to balance that personality, you could say. And this is where these are more sophisticated karmas, even than the moral intent karmas. So you've got this journey of evolution of karma, from basic karmas through moral intent karmas, and then very complex personalities. And this is very important to understand all this, not only in a self-healing manner, but also for energy healing as well, because we need to understand if we're going to burn people's karma away for them, and we can do that if we're allowed to, if the situation allows, but understanding what karmas people have and why they have them and where they are in the energy body is very important. And we'll talk more about that in a second as well. Okay, any questions so far? Next thing to mention quickly is something you have seen before, but I want to reiterate the point that karmas can have a weight to them, a weight attached to them. And the weight is also taken from the conditioning patterns in the mind. So you can have very heavy karma, for example, or you can have very light karmas. You could call it a severity of karma. How much intensity of emotion is it going to produce in the future? And it's the conditioning patterns again in the lower mind that the scale is taken from. So you've got, just to go over that quickly, you've got, and this is the karmic spectrum, you could say. You could have heavy positive karma, which is deep red. You can have medium positive karma, which is a light. You can have a light positive karma, which is an even lighter red. And then we go into the negative karmas, light negative, which is light grey. And then medium negative karmas, which is a brownish colour. And then going into heavy negative karma, which is a black colour. And these colours are how we see them in the energy body. When you train yourself to see and to look in the energy body, they look these colours. And it's held in the outside layers of the energy body, which we've talked about before, which we're going to talk a lot more about in a second. Right then, so again, just a quick reminder, the emotional cycle, because we want to look at this in much more detail now, but this slide you've seen before. This is the emotional cycle. So a trigger causes thinking patterns in the lower mind. That produces emotional energy, which circulates around the energy body, and it's coded for a particular chakra. It activates that chakra when it finds it. That chakra then activates the emotional response in the material body. Limbic system, endocrine system, etc. And that causes the emotion that we feel, that fizzing in the body. And then that creates more thinking. And then we go round and round and round. Now, we've seen that before, haven't you? You've also seen this before, that now we can say that there is also a fuel to this cycle. And because there's a fuel, we can call it an engine, the emotion engine. So that fuel, as you obviously realise, is what we've been talking about. Karma, emotion, is the fuel to that cycle. So let's talk about that in a bit more detail. So this is what you've seen before. This was in the emotional layer lesson. This is the karma emotion engine. So thinking creates new karma. Thinking in the mind creates new karma. And that karma is produced and then stored in the fuel tank, which is in the energy body. And that fuel is constantly being burnt in the engine, producing emotions. And those emotions trigger more of the thinking. So it goes round in circles. So that's just a picture of the same emotional cycle that we just talked about. Now, let's look at it in more detail. Now, this is the karma emotion engine cycle. Now, don't worry about trying to read that now. I'm going to go through each bit one by one. But that's the overall picture that we're going to need to understand. So, karma emotion engine, let's go through this. What happens in the emotional cycle? So, first of all, there's a trigger. And that usually comes from outside us, or sometimes it comes from conditioned patterns of thought in the lower mind that are already there. But generally speaking, it's somewhere outside of us. And that triggers our emotional cycle. How does it do that? Well, first of all, it starts the thinking process in the lower mind. The lower mind starts to think, and lower mind, brain, whatever we want to call it for the moment, doesn't really matter. Starts thinking patterns. And the thinking patterns activate the kara to start producing karma. So karma is produced because of our thinking patterns, as we've said before. Now that is stored in the current life karma storage. So I just showed you that little brownie oblong type thing. Just about here it is in the lower mind inside. And that's where the karma is stored temporarily. Now, upon the death of the material body, that's actually transferred to the outside layers of the energy body. And we're going to talk about that more in a second. But after death, that gets transferred to the outside layers. Then you might as well call it past life karma. From then on, it's past life karma, long-term storage in the energy body. Now, as we start to process karma, as we are burning karma in the emotional reaction that we're talking about here, it has to come through the bindu. Past life karmas have to come through the bindu. But it's the lower mind which activates it. So the thinking processes in the lower mind activate the bindu to start drawing karmas, past life karmas, from the energy body storage. Now, if you can imagine a baby that's being born, as soon as everything's ready to start working, it starts drawing through past life karmas from the energy body and starts burning it in emotional reactions. And that's why some babies cry a lot and some babies don't cry so much. It depends how much karma they're actually burning at that particular time. It also shows why personalities can differ so much in babies or children with the same upbringing. Like twins, for example. Twins quite often have very different personalities with exactly the same genetics, exactly the same upbringing, because of different karmas in their energy body. So the phala is actually processing that karma, which is being drawn through the bindu. The phala just processes that subtle energy with the programming, and then it activates the next stage. But just to mention here, there's another arrow coming from current life karma there, isn't there? So you've got two sources of karma burning at the same time, always, because the phala processes from the energy body through the bindu, but it also processes from current life karma as well. So it draws from two sources of karma, current life and past life, at the same time. And the phala activates the guna. The guna is the programming organ, and that programs all sorts of different types of energy. I mean, it programs healing energy, for example, so it's not specific to this cycle. But in this cycle, it produces emotional energy. And that emotional energy is written, or it's created with a particular programming on it. And the programming on it is coded for a particular chakra. And when it gets to that chakra, it will activate the chakra. And we're just talking about the emotion chakras here, of course, the 5 emotion chakras. And that's why they're called emotion regulators. And it's got a karmic root to it, of course. So the chakra is activated, and then what happens is that chakra then activates the emotional reaction in the material body. And that's what is known about, very well known about, in mainstream science and medicine. The limbic system, the endocrine system, circulatory system, all sorts of sensory systems. And that's what we feel as the emotion. And then that actually activates more of the thinking in the lower mind. It's an automatic reaction, you could say. So it also can affect more of the trigger as well, if it's a conditioning pattern. So that is the cycle, basically. There's one more thing to add to it, though, and that is the awareness filter. This is not, I mean, it's part of the cycle, but it's really just to show which bits that we are conscious of and which bits that we're not conscious of. And as you can see by the 2 arrows going into the awareness filter, there's only 2 parts of this reaction that we're actually conscious of. That is the emotional reaction and the thinking. And if you remember, that ties in nicely with the idea that there's only 3 categories of conscious experiences anyway. Emotions, thoughts, and sensory experiences. Not aware of anything else in the filter. So there we go. That is the karma emotion engine cycle. I will upload that diagram to Classroom as well, of course. So now let me go back to the anatomy diagram and just talk through it one more time. Now you've seen or talked through that diagram. So let's start at the beginning. The trigger, somewhere outside of us, activates the lower mind thinking. So that happens in the brain area, lower mind area, thinking patterns. That actually activates the kara, brown blob. The kara then sends the karma that it produces down this brown tube to the karma storage. Karma storage is there in the lower mind. Current life karma storage. And upon death of the material body, then that gets transferred to the energy body, the outside layers of the energy body, for long-term storage. But there's 2, essentially in any incarnation there is 2 places where karma is being stored. So during an emotional reaction, again, thinking activates phala, karma processing. So the phala actually starts to draw karma, activated by the thinking process. So that's the red double blobby thing. And as you can see, it's got a green tube coming out of it, coming from the bindu, the blue dot. That is drawing past life karmas. It's also got a brown tube coming out of it, which is going down to the karma storage in the lower mind. So there's 2 places that it's drawing karma from at any time that it's processing karma. Current life karma and past life karma. And as you can see, this little green tube there is connected to the guna, the programming organ, because the phala reads the programming on the karma, and then it activates the guna to produce emotional energy. Then that emotional energy is sent through that green tube into this big green tube, which is the lower mind circulation system. And then from there on, it goes to a chakra. Let's say it comes down here through this big green tube, goes to the throat chakra, let's say, activates the throat chakra. That activates the emotional response in the body, the material body, which then activates more of the thinking in the lower mind. And then we go round and round and round. And that, we could say, is what some people call the wheel of karma, or in some Eastern spiritual traditions, samsara, or the endless cycle of suffering, you could say, of constant rebirths or constant reincarnation. Having to come back into incarnations to burn off karma, because the organs involved are in the lower mind, which is part of the material body, and therefore you need to be in an incarnation to burn off karma.